The windshield wipers squeaked back and forth, fighting against the heavy rain that pounded Daniel Harris's old pickup truck. Lightning flashed across the darkening sky, briefly illuminating the empty country road ahead. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as his mind wandered to the stack of unpaid bills waiting at home. Just 3 more miles, he muttered to himself, squinting through the storm. The hardware store had been quiet today, meaning fewer hours and less pay. Emily needed new school supplies, and the mortgage payment was coming up soon. Another flash of lightning lit up the roadside ditch, and Daniel's heart skipped a beat. There, just ahead, lay something that didn't belong. A small, dark bundle that seemed to move slightly in the wind. He slowed the truck, his practical mind telling him it was probably just a garbage bag blown loose from someone's trash. But something made him stop. Daniel pulled over, flicking on his hazard lights. The rain immediately soaked through his thin work shirt as he stepped out. His work boots splashed in puddles as he approached the mysterious shape. What he saw made his blood run cold. It was a child, a little girl, curled up on her side, her clothes soaked and muddy. Her face was pale, almost gray in the dim light, and her dark hair was matted against her cheeks. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old. "Hey, sweetheart," Daniel called softly, kneeling beside her. He touched her shoulder gently. She was ice cold. When she didn't respond, panic gripped his chest. With trembling fingers, he checked for a pulse, releasing a shaky breath when he found one, weak but steady. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. He should call the police, an ambulance, child services, but out here, emergency response could take forever in this weather. The nearest hospital was 30 minutes away. Looking at her threadbare clothes and prominent cheekbones, Daniel's heart ached. This child needed help now. Without further hesitation, he shrugged off his work jacket and carefully wrapped it around her tiny frame. She was frighteningly light as he lifted her into his arms. "Hang on, little one," he whispered, hurrying back to the truck. He placed her gently in the passenger seat, cranking up the heat. His own clothes were soaked through now, but he barely noticed. The drive home seemed to take forever. Every few seconds, Daniel glanced at the unconscious girl, watching for any change. She remained still, her breathing shallow but present. Finally, the lights of his modest farmhouse came into view. Emily's bedroom light was on. She'd be doing homework, like she always did after dinner. Daniel pulled up close to the front porch and honked twice, their signal that he needed help. Emily appeared at the door almost immediately, her long brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her eyes widened as she watched her father carefully lift the small bundle from the truck. "Dad, what's going on?" she called out, holding the screen door open. "Clear off the couch," Daniel instructed, his voice tight with worry. "And grab some blankets, the warm ones from the hall closet." Emily moved quickly, shoving her textbooks aside. "Oh my God," she gasped as Daniel laid the girl down. "Is she—" "She's alive," Daniel assured her, though his face was grim. "But she's freezing. Can you get her out of these wet clothes while I grab some towels?" Without hesitation, Emily nodded, her natural compassion taking over. "Of course. Should we call 911? Daniel paused in the hallway. "Let's warm her up first. She needs immediate care right now." He didn't voice his deeper concerns about where this child came from or what might have happened to her. Working together, father and daughter gently dried the mysterious girl and wrapped her in warm blankets. Emily brought one of her old nightgowns, which hung loose on the child's thin frame. Daniel built up the fire in the wood stove while Emily heated some chicken broth, just in case. "She's so skinny, Dad," Emily whispered, touching the girl's bony wrist. "Look at her hands. They're all scratched up." Daniel nodded solemnly. Up close, in the warm light of their living room, the girl's condition was even more apparent. Her face was gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes. Old bruises marked her arms, and her feet were covered in blisters. "Who would do this to a child?" Emily's voice cracked with emotion. "I don't know, sweetie." Daniel sat heavily in his armchair, watching the girl's chest rise and fall. "I just couldn't leave her there." Thunder rumbled outside as Emily arranged another blanket over the girl's feet. "What are we going to do?" Daniel ran a hand through his graying hair. "For tonight, we keep her warm and safe. Tomorrow—" He trailed off, knowing the complications that tomorrow would bring. Emily moved to sit on the arm of his chair, just like she used to do when she was little. "You did the right thing, Dad. Mom would be proud." The mention of his late wife brought a sad smile to Daniel's face. Sarah had always been the one to take in strays, injured birds, lost cats, lonely neighborhood kids. Her compassion lived on in their daughter. They moved the girl to Emily's room, tucking her into the warm bed. Emily insisted on sleeping on the floor beside her, just in case she wakes up scared. Daniel didn't argue. His daughter had inherited her mother's heart. Now, standing in the doorway of Emily's bedroom, Daniel watched both girls. Emily had finally fallen asleep, curled up in her sleeping bag, one hand resting near the bed as if ready to offer comfort at a moment's notice. The mysterious girl's sleep was fitful, her small face twitching with unknown dreams. Lightning flashed again, followed by another low rumble of thunder. The storm showed no signs of letting up, much like the storm of questions in Daniel's mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? What would happen when authorities got involved? But watching her sleep, seeing how young and vulnerable she was, Daniel knew he'd made the only choice he could. Maybe it wasn't the smartest decision, and maybe it would bring complications he couldn't yet imagine. But in his heart, he knew it was right. His quiet life had indeed changed forever, but looking at his daughter's protective posture and the lost child they'd rescued, Daniel felt a certainty he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as a family. The aroma of warm oatmeal drifted through the modest farmhouse, gently rousing Daniel from his fitful sleep on the living room couch. Sunlight streamed through the windows, a stark contrast to last night's violent storm. His back ached from the lumpy cushions, but he'd insisted Emily take her bed while their mysterious guest used Emily's room. Daniel padded into the kitchen, finding Emily stirring a pot of oatmeal. At 15, she already had her mother's nurturing spirit. She'd added brown sugar and a splash of milk just the way she liked it. "Morning, Dad," Emily whispered, glancing toward her bedroom door. "She's still sleeping. I checked on her earlier. Her fever's gone down a little." Daniel ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "That's good. Did she say anything?" Emily shook her head. "Just little whispers. I couldn't make out the words." A floorboard creaked, and they both turned to see the girl standing in the doorway. She looked even smaller in Emily's borrowed pajamas, the sleeves rolled up several times. Her dark hair was tangled, and her eyes darted between them with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. "Hey there," Daniel said softly, keeping his distance. "Emily made some breakfast. Are you hungry?" The girl nodded, almost imperceptibly. Emily pulled out a chair at their worn kitchen table, and the child carefully settled into it, her feet dangling above the floor. "Here you go," Emily said, placing a small bowl of oatmeal in front of her. "Careful, it's hot." They watched as the girl took tiny spoonfuls, eating as if the food might disappear at any moment. Daniel's heart clenched at the sight. "Can you tell us your name?" Emily asked gently. The girl's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't remember." Daniel exchanged worried glances with Emily. "That's okay," he assured her. "We need to call you something, though." He studied her delicate features, the way she held herself with such careful grace despite her obvious exhaustion. "How about we call you Grace, just until you remember?" The girl, Grace, considered this for a moment, then nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Over the next week, their temporary arrangement fell into a rhythm. Emily stayed home from school for a few days to help, teaching Grace simple card games and reading her stories. Daniel called in favors from Sarah, a nurse at the local clinic who discreetly checked Grace over and provided basic medications for her lingering cough. Grace slowly began to trust them. She still spoke rarely and softly, but her eyes followed Emily everywhere, lighting up whenever the teenager entered the room. She helped Emily with small chores, folding laundry with careful precision and setting the table for meals. Daniel made the necessary calls. The sheriff came by, hat in hand, to take down details and check missing persons reports. "Nothing matching her description in the Tri-County area," he reported. "We'll keep looking, but—" He shrugged, leaving the implications unspoken. Word spread through their small town, as it always did. Mrs. Peterson from the church brought over a casserole and some hand-me-down clothes. "Bless your heart, Daniel Harris," she said, peering around him to catch a glimpse of Grace, taking in that poor child like that. Others weren't as kind. Daniel overheard whispers at the hardware store about that mystery girl, and What kind of man takes in a strange child? He kept his head high, focusing on Grace's improving health and the way she was slowly blooming under their care. Emily proved to be the key to drawing Grace out of her shell. The two girls became inseparable, with Emily showing remarkable patience and understanding. She taught Grace to braid friendship bracelets, helped her arrange flowers from the garden in mason jars, and shared her favorite stuffed animals. "Look, Dad," Emily called one afternoon. Grace had drawn a picture, 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house. The smallest figure wore a dress that looked like one of Emily's hand-me-downs. "Is that us?" Daniel asked, and Grace nodded, offering him one of her rare smiles. The transformation was gradual, but steady. Grace's hollow cheeks filled out as she ate regular meals. The dark circles under her eyes faded as she slept through the night, usually curled up next to Emily. Her cough disappeared, and color returned to her pale skin. One evening, as Daniel tucked the girls into bed, they now shared Emily's room, with a cot for Grace beside the bed. Grace did something unexpected. She folded her hands and closed her eyes. "Dear God," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you for Mr. Harris and Emily. Thank you for saving me and giving me a warm bed and food and—" She paused, opening one eye to peek at Emily. "And a friend like a sister." Daniel felt his throat tighten and blinked rapidly against the sudden moisture in his eyes. He hadn't heard a child's bedtime prayer since Emily was small, since before his wife passed. The simple words filled a void in his heart he hadn't realized was there. Emily reached down from her bed and took Grace's hand. The two girls smiled at each other in the dim light of the bedside lamp, and Daniel saw in that moment what he'd been missing these past lonely years. The warmth of a full house, the joy of children's laughter, the feeling of being needed and loved. "Good night, girls," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. "Good night, Dad," Emily replied. "Good night, Mr. Harris," Grace whispered, snuggling deeper under her blankets. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment longer, watching as their breathing evened out into sleep. The stack of bills on his desk seemed less daunting now, the whispers of the town less important. Something new had taken root in their home, something that felt a lot like hope. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows of the Harris farmhouse on a peaceful Sunday morning. Daniel sat in his weathered recliner, absently flipping through television channels while keeping one eye on Emily and Grace at the kitchen table. The girls huddled together over sheets of paper, colored pencils scattered between them like fallen autumn leaves. "Look, I drew our house." Grace held up her picture, her voice carrying that slight tremor of uncertainty that still hadn't fully disappeared after 3 weeks in their care. The simple drawing showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a lopsided house, all of them wearing enormous smiles. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Daniel called out, his heart warming at how she'd included herself in their family portrait. Emily leaned over, pointing at details in the drawing with encouraging words that made Grace beam with pride. The television droned in the background as Daniel watched them, marveling at how naturally the girls had bonded. Emily had blossomed into a protective older sister, while Grace's initially haunted eyes now sparkled with life more each day. The sound of their giggling almost made him miss the news anchor's serious tone cutting through the morning peace. "Breaking news from New York City," the reporter announced. "The Whitmore family has renewed their search for their daughter, Amelia, who was kidnapped 6 years ago. The billionaire couple is offering an unprecedented reward." Daniel's finger froze on the remote as a photograph filled the screen. His breath caught in his throat. The image showed a little girl with familiar delicate features, golden brown hair, and distinctive green eyes, eyes that matched those of the child currently coloring at his kitchen table. A sharp gasp from behind made him turn. Grace stood rigid, her drawing forgotten on the floor, staring at the television with an expression of shocked recognition. The color had drained from her face. "Grace?" Emily touched her arm gently. "Are you okay?" Grace's lower lip trembled. I don't—" She shook her head, backing away from the TV until she bumped into a chair. Daniel quickly switched off the television, but the damage was done. Emily picked up Grace's fallen drawing and studied the girl in the news photo, then looked at Grace with widening eyes. "Dad," she whispered, "she looks exactly like—" "I know." Daniel cut her off softly, not wanting to overwhelm Grace further. He crossed the room and knelt beside the trembling child. "Grace, honey, do you remember anything About that picture? About the name Amelia? Grace's eyes filled with tears. Everything's fuzzy, like trying to remember a dream that keeps slipping away. She clutched Daniel's sleeve. Am I that girl? Emily sat down next to them, wrapping an arm around Grace's shoulders. The eyes are the same, she said quietly. And that little dimple when you smile. Dad, what do we do? Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He'd known this day might come, had even prayed for it, believing Grace's real family must be searching for her. But now that it was here, his heart felt like lead in his chest. We need to call Sheriff Martinez, he said finally. It's the right thing to do. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The sheriff arrived first, then state investigators, followed by specialists from New York. They treated Grace gently, aware of her fragile emotional state, but their presence filled the farmhouse with an undercurrent of tension. DNA samples were taken discreetly, a simple cheek swab that made Grace squeeze Daniel's hand so tight his fingers tingled. They waited 3 agonizing days for the results, during which Grace barely spoke, clinging to Emily like a lifeline during the day and crying herself to sleep at night. When the confirmation came, it hit like a thunderbolt. Grace was indeed Amelia Whitmore, the lost heiress to one of New York's most prominent families. The investigators spoke of miracle recoveries and cold cases solved, but Daniel could only focus on Grace's face as reality settled over their little family like a heavy blanket. That evening, after the officials had finally left with promises to return tomorrow, Daniel went through their normal bedtime routine with mechanical movements. He helped Grace brush her teeth, watched her change into her favorite borrowed pajamas, Emily's old ones with faded butterflies, and tucked her into bed as he had every night since finding her. Grace's small hand shot out from under the covers, grabbing his much larger one with surprising strength. In the dim glow of her nightlight, her eyes shimmered with tears. I don't want to leave, she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. Daniel's throat tightened painfully. He wanted to promise her everything would be okay, that nothing would change, but he couldn't lie. Instead, he sat on the edge of her bed, still holding her hand, as the weight of uncertainty pressed down on both their hearts. The morning sun cast long shadows across Daniel's gravel driveway as a sleek black limousine wound its way up the narrow country road. Emily pressed her face against the living room window, her breath fogging the glass. Grace stood behind her, clinging to Daniel's hand with trembling fingers. They're here, Emily whispered, her voice tight with worry. Daniel squeezed Grace's small hand. It's going to be okay, sweetheart. But his own heart hammered against his ribs as the expensive car came to a stop. A uniformed driver stepped out first, opening the rear door with practiced smoothness. 2 men in dark suits emerged, lawyers or security, Daniel guessed, followed by a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver-streaked hair. Charles Whitmore's face was etched with lines of worry and hope. Then came Evelyn Whitmore. She was elegant in a cream-colored dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, but her composed appearance crumbled the instant she saw Grace through the window. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears already streaming down her cheeks. Grace's grip on Daniel's hand tightened. I'm scared, she whispered. We're right here with you, Emily said, moving to Grace's other side. Daniel led them onto the front porch, his worn work boots creaking against the wooden boards. The contrast between his simple home and the Whitmores' obvious wealth had never felt more stark. Evelyn rushed forward, her heels crunching on gravel. Amelia, she cried out, stumbling slightly in her haste. Charles caught her elbow, steadying her as they approached. Grace shrunk back against Daniel's leg, overwhelmed by the stranger calling her by an unfamiliar name. Evelyn slowed, reading the fear in her daughter's face. She knelt down, her expensive dress touching the dusty porch. Hello, sweetheart, she said softly, tears still flowing. I'm your mother. Grace looked up at Daniel, seeking reassurance. He nodded gently, and she took a tentative step forward. Evelyn opened her arms, and after another moment's hesitation, Grace allowed herself to be embraced. The reunion that followed was a blur of tears and questions. The Whitmores' lawyers hovered nearby, papers in hand, while Charles stood watching his wife and daughter with reddened eyes. Emily stayed close to Grace, ready to offer comfort if needed. We can never thank you enough, Charles said to Daniel, his voice rough with emotion. For saving her, caring for her. Anyone would have done the same, Daniel replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. After some discussion, the Whitmores suggested Grace visit their Manhattan home to ease the transition. "Please," Evelyn added quickly, "you and Emily must come too. Grace clearly needs you both." The next day found them landing at a private airstrip in New York, the Harrises' first time on any plane, let alone a private jet. A second limousine whisked them through the city's busy streets to the Upper East Side, where the Whitmore mansion stood like something from a fairy tale. Emily's eyes widened as they passed through wrought iron gates. "It's like a castle," she breathed, taking in the limestone facade and manicured gardens. Daniel tugged self-consciously at his jacket, the same one he'd wrapped Grace in that stormy night. The worn leather seemed to advertise his working-class status among the polished marble and crystal chandeliers of the entrance hall. Grace hadn't released Emily's hand since they'd left the farmhouse, and she showed no signs of letting go now. Her eyes darted around the grand space, overwhelmed by its opulence. "Would you like to see your room, dear?" Evelyn asked hopefully. When Grace hesitated, she added, "Emily can come too, of course." They followed Evelyn up a sweeping staircase, their footsteps muffled by thick carpeting. The bedroom she led them to was larger than Daniel's entire living room, decorated in soft pinks and creams. A canopy bed dominated one wall, draped in silk. "We've kept it just as it was," Evelyn explained, her voice catching, "though we've updated some things for your age now." Grace's grip on Emily's hand tightened as she took in the unfamiliar space. The room was beautiful, but there was something untouched about it, like a museum display of childhood rather than a lived-in space. "Look at all your stuffed animals," Emily said encouragingly, trying to ease the tension. "They've been waiting for you." After dinner in a dining room that could have seated 20, Grace finally succumbed to exhaustion. The emotional day had taken its toll, and she fell asleep almost instantly in her silk-covered bed, still wearing the simple cotton pajamas from home. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching her chest recent fall. Emily had been given a guest room next door, but he knew she'd probably sneak in later to comfort Grace if needed. The soft glow of a Tiffany lamp cast shadows across the expensive furnishings, making everything seem slightly unreal. "This isn't our world," he whispered to himself, his calloused hand resting on the polished doorframe. The morning light streamed through tall windows into the Whitmore mansion's formal dining room. Crystal glasses sparkled on the mahogany table while uniformed staff moved silently, serving plates of perfectly arranged fruit and golden pastries. Grace sat stiffly in her chair, her feet barely touching the floor, watching a server pour orange juice into her glass. "Would you like some more croissants, Miss Amelia?" the butler asked, using her birth name. Grace shook her head, her eyes darting toward the kitchen door. Without warning, she slid from her chair and scampered away, her small feet pattering across the marble floor. Evelyn half rose from her seat, concern crossing her face, but Margaret touched her sister's arm gently. "Let her go," Margaret said softly. "She needs time." In the warm, busy kitchen, Daniel and Emily sat at a worn wooden table tucked in the corner. They had already found boxes of cereal in the pantry, a familiar comfort in this strange new world. Grace burst through the door, her face lighting up at the sight of them. "Can I have some too?" she asked, climbing onto the bench beside Emily. Daniel poured milk over a bowl of cornflakes, sliding it toward her with a warm smile. "Always room for one more." Grace giggled as milk splashed onto the table. Emily handed her a paper napkin, and soon all three were crunching their cereal, sharing quiet jokes and comfortable silence. It felt like home. Days turned into weeks, and a gentle rhythm emerged. Grace spent mornings with the Whitmores, afternoons with Daniel and Emily, and evenings were often shared between both families. The mansion's gardens became their favorite meeting place, where social barriers seemed to fade among the roses and fountains. Emily flourished in this new arrangement. She taught Grace to make daisy chains and showed her how to sketch the flowers. Together they created a scrapbook, filling it with pressed petals and drawings of their adventures. Their laughter echoed through the mansion's halls, brightening even the darkest corners. "Look what we made," Grace would exclaim, proudly showing her artwork to both Daniel and Evelyn. The two parents would exchange glances over her head, seeing how their daughter's joy bridged the gap between their worlds. The Whitmores' attitude toward Daniel shifted as they learned more about him. One afternoon, Evelyn discovered the stack of medical bills he'd paid for Grace's initial care, along with receipts for new clothes and school supplies, all charged to his credit card despite his modest income. "You never asked for anything in return," Evelyn said quietly, holding the papers. Daniel shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. She needed help. That's all that mattered. It was Margaret who seemed to understand him best. She preferred the kitchen garden to formal parties, just as he did. They often found themselves working side by side, planting vegetables or weeding flower beds while Grace and Emily played nearby. "You have dirt on your nose," Margaret told him one day, her eyes twinkling. Daniel wiped his face with his sleeve, leaving an even bigger smudge. She laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and handed him a clean handkerchief. The staff began to notice how Grace brightened whenever Daniel arrived. She would run to him, showing off new toys or books, seeking his approval even as she gradually accepted her place in the Whitmore family. Evelyn watched these moments with a mixture of gratitude and understanding, seeing how Daniel's steady presence helped her daughter heal. One particularly beautiful evening, Daniel, Emily, and Grace sat on a blanket in the garden. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, while fireflies began to dance among the flower beds. Emily was teaching Grace to make shadow puppets against the garden wall, their giggles floating on the warm breeze. "And this one's a rabbit," Emily demonstrated, her fingers creating long ears that made Grace clap with delight. Daniel leaned back on his elbows, watching his daughters, because that's how he thought of them now, even knowing Grace belonged to two families. The weight of uncertainty he'd carried since finding her that stormy night seemed to lift slightly. Margaret stood at the garden door, observing the scene. She'd brought out a tray of lemonade but paused, not wanting to interrupt the moment. Her presence was gentle, complementing the peaceful scene rather than intruding upon it. "Your turn, Dad," Grace called out, patting the space beside her. The word "Dad" slipped out naturally, and neither she nor Daniel commented on it, though both their faces glowed with quiet joy. Daniel scooted closer, making an elaborate bird shadow that had both girls laughing. Emily leaned against his shoulder, content, while Grace attempted to copy his hand movements. The garden filled with their warmth and happiness, creating a picture of family that transcended blood ties. Margaret finally approached with the lemonade, setting it down on a nearby table. "Room for one more?" she asked softly. "Always," Daniel replied, echoing his words from that morning in the kitchen. Their eyes met briefly, sharing an understanding that needed no words. The four of them sat together in the growing dusk, passing around cookies and lemonade, telling stories and making plans for tomorrow's adventures. The formal mansion behind them seemed to fade away, leaving just this simple moment of connection and belonging. Grace curled up against Daniel's side, her small hand finding his. Emily stretched out on the blanket, her head resting on his knee. Margaret sat close by, her presence adding a gentle completeness to their circle. For the first time since arriving at the Whitmore estate, Daniel felt truly at peace, daring to imagine that perhaps he belonged here too, not because of wealth or status, but because of love's ability to create family from strangers. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate sparkled like something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across polished marble floors, while string musicians played softly from a raised platform. Hundreds of New York's wealthiest citizens mingled in designer evening wear, their jewelry catching the light with every gesture. Daniel Harris tugged at his borrowed suit collar, feeling like an imposter. The fabric was fine, too fine, and the shoulders felt stiff and unnatural compared to his usual work clothes. He stood near a towering flower arrangement, trying to blend into the background as important people discussed important things around him. Emily, looking lovely in a new blue dress, squeezed his arm. "You look great, Dad," she whispered, though her own eyes were wide taking in the spectacle. "Like a penguin with stage fright," Daniel murmured back, making her giggle. Across the room, Grace sat at the main table with the Whitmores, wearing a white party dress that probably cost more than Daniel's truck. She kept glancing his way, fidgeting with her napkin. Even surrounded by luxury, she seemed uncomfortable, like a wild bird in a golden cage. Suddenly, Grace stood up and walked purposefully toward Daniel, ignoring her birth mother's gentle call to return. The crowd parted, watching curiously as the newly discovered heiress approached the humble hardware store worker who had saved her. "Dance with me?" Grace asked, holding out her small hand. Her eyes shone with determination. Daniel's throat tightened with emotion. I don't know these fancy steps, sweetheart. Just like we do at home, she insisted. Please? How could he refuse? Daniel took her hand and led her to the dance floor as the musicians began a new song. He could feel hundreds of eyes on them, some warm, others calculating and cold. But Grace just beamed up at him as they started to move. They swayed together like they had in his living room, Grace standing on his feet while he shuffled in slow circles. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was real, pure, the kind of dance a father shares with his daughter. To Daniel's surprise, scattered applause broke out. More people joined in until the whole ballroom was clapping. Even Evelyn Whitmore had tears in her eyes, watching them with a soft smile. But not everyone shared in the moment's magic. From his place near the bar, Victor Whitmore's face darkened with barely concealed contempt. He pulled out his phone and began typing furiously. The next morning, Daniel's peaceful breakfast was shattered by Emily bursting into the kitchen, her face pale. She thrust her phone at him, showing a gossip website's headline. Gold digger dad? Questions arise about motivations of man who found missing Whitmore heiress. The article was brutal, suggesting Daniel had orchestrated everything for money and fame. Anonymous sources close to the family claimed he was manipulating Grace's traumatized mind for his own gain. There were hints about his modest income, his struggle with bills, painting every act of kindness as calculated manipulation. It's not true, Emily's voice cracked. How can they say such awful things about you? Daniel pulled her into a hug, even as his own hands shook. People will believe what they want to believe, honey. But it didn't stop there. More stories appeared daily, each more damaging than the last. Reporters camped outside their house. Old acquaintances sold invented stories about Daniel's character. Victor Whitmore appeared on morning shows, expressing grave concerns about Grace's living situation. Legal papers arrived next, motions to restrict Daniel's access to Grace, demands for psychological evaluations, accusations of emotional manipulation. Grace's visits became tense, overshadowed by lawyers and supervision. One afternoon, she overheard Victor arguing loudly with Evelyn in the mansion's study. He's using her, Victor's voice boomed. That kind of man doesn't do anything without expecting payment. He's probably planning to write a book, sell movie rights. He saved her life, Evelyn protested. He spent his savings caring for her when, wake up, Evelyn, he's playing you, playing all of us. The sooner we cut him out completely, the better. Grace ran from the study in tears, finding Emily in the garden. The girls held each other, both terrified of losing the family they'd built. That night, Emily tried to hide her red eyes at dinner, but Daniel noticed. He heard her muffled sobs later, coming from her bedroom. His daughter, who had bloomed with joy since Grace entered their lives, was wilting under the strain of potential loss. Daniel sat alone at his kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the stack of legal documents. His hands trembled as he read through them again. Allegations of exploitation, demands for psychiatric evaluation, threats of criminal investigation if he didn't cease contact voluntarily. The walls of his modest home seemed to close in. Photos of Grace smiled down at him from the refrigerator. Her first day of school, birthday parties, quiet moments of family life. He'd never asked for any of this. He'd just found a hurt child and tried to help, the way any decent person would. But maybe that's what made him dangerous to people like Victor Whitmore. Decency without ulterior motives was something they couldn't understand. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper in the dark kitchen. Maybe they're right. Maybe she's better off without me. The words hung in the air like poison, even as his heart screamed against them. He looked down at his calloused hands, hands that had held Grace through nightmares, braided her hair, taught her to plant flowers in the garden. How could love like that be wrong? But the legal papers didn't care about love. They cared about wealth, influence, and social standing. All the things Daniel could never provide. The marble steps of the New York Supreme Court building gleamed under the harsh morning sun. Television vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Reporters clutched microphones and notepads, their voices creating a constant buzz of speculation and commentary. Inside the austere courtroom, dark wooden panels stretched from floor to ceiling. The air felt thick with tension, making it hard to breathe. Grace sat between Charles and Evelyn Whitmore on the plaintiff's side, her small frame nearly swallowed by the massive leather chair. She wore a pressed navy dress that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly salary, but her eyes kept darting back to where Daniel and Emily sat 3 rows behind. Daniel's borrowed suit felt tight around his neck. His calloused hands, more used to handling hardware store inventory than legal documents, lay still in his lap. Next to him, Emily gripped his arm, her face pale with worry. She had insisted on wearing the friendship bracelet Grace had made her, its colorful thread standing out against her simple black dress. Victor Whitmore sat at the front table beside his expensive legal team, his silver hair perfectly styled and his designer suit immaculate. His lead attorney, Mr. Patterson, rose to address the court, his voice carrying an edge of calculated disdain. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mr. Harris deliberately withheld information about Amelia Whitmore's identity, Patterson declared, gesturing toward Daniel. By failing to report her presence immediately, he effectively kidnapped her through negligence. Daniel's public defender, Ms. Roberts, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She was young and earnest, but clearly overwhelmed by the opposition's resources. Patterson continued his attack, projecting photographs onto a large screen. Mr. Harris lives in a modest 2-bedroom home with questionable heating. He works retail, barely making ends meet. Meanwhile, the Whitmores can provide Amelia with the finest education, health care, and opportunities befitting her true station. Emily's grip on Daniel's arm tightened. He could feel her trembling with anger. Furthermore, Patterson's voice grew harder. Mr. Harris exposed Amelia to potential danger by not seeking immediate medical attention. His daughter, Emily, a mere teenager, was left responsible for childcare while he worked long hours. This is not a suitable environment for an heiress of the Whitmore fortune. Grace's shoulders hunched forward at these words, and she half turned in her chair, seeking Daniel's eyes. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, though his heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. When Ms. Roberts presented their defense, her voice seemed thin compared to Patterson's polished accusations. Mr. Harris found a sick child and gave her a home. He spent his savings on her care, asked for nothing in return, and notified authorities as soon as he recognized her from the news. But Patterson quickly countered, producing social media posts and local newspaper articles. Mr. Harris has been basking in local celebrity status, known as the hero who saved the Whitmore heir. His daughter's social media accounts show multiple posts about their new sister. This suggests premeditation in keeping Amelia for themselves. Emily stood up suddenly, tears streaming down her face. That's not true. We love Grace. We're her family too. The judge banged his gavel. Young lady, please be seated or leave the courtroom. Daniel gently pulled Emily back down, wrapping an arm around her shaking shoulders. He could feel his own resolve crumbling as he watched Grace's distressed expression. The girl he'd grown to love as a daughter looked torn between two worlds, and he realized that his presence in her life might be causing more harm than good. During a brief recess, Daniel stood in the courthouse hallway, staring out a tall window at the city skyline. The Whitmores could give Grace everything he couldn't, the best schools, travel, opportunities he could never provide. His love suddenly seemed inadequate against the weight of what she could have. Dad, you can't give up, Emily pleaded, her voice rough from crying. Grace needs us. She needs you. Daniel pulled his daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. Sometimes loving someone means letting them go, sweetheart. No, Emily pushed away from him, her face fierce despite her tears. That's what everyone said when Mom died too. That time heals everything. But it doesn't. Grace is our family now. You taught me that family fights for each other. Before Daniel could respond, they were called back into the courtroom. The afternoon proceeded with character witnesses, hardware store customers praising Daniel's integrity, town officials confirming his cooperation with authorities, even Grace's doctor testifying about her improved health under his care. But it felt hollow against the Whitmores' parade of educational experts, child psychologists, and financial advisors. The drive home that evening was silent. Their small farmhouse looked shabby and dark against the setting sun. Inside, Emily ran straight to Grace's room, still filled with the stuffed animals and art supplies they'd bought together. She collapsed onto the bed, burying her face in Grace's pillow, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Daniel stood in the doorway, his throat tight with unshed tears. The room still smelled faintly of the lavender lotion Grace loved. Crayon drawings covered one wall, stick figures holding hands, with "My Family" written in childish letters across the top. A half-finished puzzle lay on the small desk, waiting for hands that might never return to complete it. He crossed the room and sat beside Emily, gathering her into his arms like he used to when she was small. She clung to him, her tears soaking his shirt. "Please, Dad," she whispered. "Please don't let them take her away." Daniel held his daughter close, his own tears finally falling as he prayed silently for guidance. The empty house echoed with memories of Grace's laughter, and he wondered if doing the right thing meant breaking not just his own heart, but Emily's as well. The morning sun filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Grace sat between the Whitmores, her small hands fidgeting with the hem of her navy blue dress. Daniel and Emily watched from their seats behind the defense table, their faces etched with worry. Judge Marion Peterson shuffled through her papers, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations until Grace suddenly stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "Your Honor?" Her voice trembled but carried clearly across the hushed room. "May I please say something?" The judge looked up, surprised. She studied the young girl's determined face for a long moment. "This is highly unusual," she said, glancing at the attorneys. "However, given the circumstances—" She paused, then nodded. "Very well, Grace. Please come forward." Victor Whitmore started to object, but Evelyn grabbed his arm, silencing him with a stern look. Grace walked to the witness stand, her patent leather shoes clicking against the floor. She looked so small sitting there, but her eyes shone with purpose. "Please tell us what you'd like to say," Judge Peterson said kindly. Grace took a deep breath. "I remember the night Mr. Harris found me," she began, her voice growing stronger. "I was so cold and hungry. I couldn't walk anymore. Everything was dark and scary." She twisted her hands in her lap. "But then there was a light, and someone wrapped me in a warm jacket that smelled like wood and coffee." Daniel blinked back tears, remembering that stormy night. Emily reached for his hand and squeezed it tight. "When I woke up, I was in a real bed with soft blankets," Grace continued. "Emily made me oatmeal with brown sugar, and Mr. Harris got medicine when I was sick. They didn't know me, but they took care of me anyway." She looked directly at Victor, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Harris isn't rich like my birth family. Sometimes I heard him counting pennies late at night to buy my medicine, but he never complained. He just smiled and told me everything would be okay." Evelyn dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as Grace went on. "He taught me about God's love and how to pray. He showed me that family isn't just about having the same blood. It's about who loves you and protects you no matter what." The courtroom was completely silent now, hanging on every word from the little girl's mouth. "Emily became my sister. She helped me with nightmares and taught me to draw. Mr. Harris became my dad, not because he had to, but because he chose to." Grace's voice cracked slightly. "I love my birth parents. I'm so happy I found them again, but Mr. Harris is my dad too. He saved my life when I was lost and alone. Please, don't take him away from me." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Uncle Victor says mean things about him, but they're not true. Mr. Harris never wanted money or fame. He just wanted to help a scared little girl who had nobody else." Victor's face reddened as heads turned to stare at him. The judge's expression hardened as she looked in his direction. "I want both families," Grace said firmly. "I need both families, because love isn't something you have to split up or choose between. It just grows bigger and bigger until there's enough for everyone." Emily was crying openly now, and Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Even the court reporter wiped her eyes as she typed. Evelyn stood up suddenly, her voice thick with emotion. "Your Honor, we wish to withdraw all claims against Daniel Harris." She turned to face the lawyers. "You're dismissed, all of you." Charles Whitmore rose to stand beside his wife. "We've been blind," he announced. "This man didn't steal our daughter. He protected her when we couldn't. He gave her back to us whole and loved." The judge smiled, removing her glasses. "Well, it seems this young lady has more wisdom than all the attorneys combined. I believe we're done here." As the court began to adjourn, Evelyn crossed the room to where Daniel stood. She wrapped him in a tight hug, her tears dampening his shoulder. "You gave us our daughter back," she whispered fiercely. and we'll never take her from you." Grace ran to join them, throwing her arms around both Evelyn and Daniel. Emily joined the embrace, and for a moment they stood together, two families united by one child's love. Victor slipped out of the courtroom alone, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hands, while the morning sun streamed through the windows, wrapping them all in its warm, golden light. The late summer breeze rustled through the tall grass as Daniel worked on the broken fence post. His strong hands gripped the hammer firmly, driving nails into weathered wood with practiced precision. Sweat dotted his forehead under the warm afternoon sun, but a content smile played at the corners of his mouth as squeals of laughter drifted across the yard. "Can't catch me," Grace called out, her golden hair streaming behind her as she darted between the apple trees. Emily followed close behind, her longer legs giving her an advantage as they played their endless game of tag. "Just wait!" Emily laughed, reaching out to grab her sister's sleeve but missing by inches. Daniel paused his work to watch them, his heart swelling at the sight. It seemed like yesterday that he'd found Grace lying helpless by the roadside. Now she was healthy and happy, her eyes bright with joy instead of fear. The transformation still amazed him. A sleek silver SUV pulled up the gravel driveway, and Charles and Evelyn Whitmore stepped out. Instead of their usual formal attire, they wore casual clothes. Charles in khakis and a polo shirt, Evelyn in a flowing sundress. She carried a large wicker picnic basket while Charles balanced a cooler. "We brought lunch," Evelyn called out cheerfully, "and homemade lemonade." The girls abandoned their game and raced over to greet them. Grace hugged both her birth parents tightly while Emily helped carry the basket. There was no tension now, no awkward formality, just the easy warmth of family. Daniel set down his hammer and walked over to join them. "You're just in time," he said. "I was about to take a break anyway." They spread blankets under the shade of the old oak tree, laying out sandwiches, fresh fruit, and cookies. It had become their weekly ritual, these casual Sunday afternoon picnics that bridged their two worlds. Charles talked about his latest business venture, while Evelyn shared stories about her charity work. The girls chattered about school and friends, switching seats to spend time with both sets of parents. "The fence looks better," Charles noted, glancing at Daniel's handiwork. "Let me know if you need help with any other repairs around here." "Thanks," Daniel replied, no longer feeling defensive about the offer. Actually, the barn roof could use some work before winter. As they cleaned up from lunch, another car pulled into the driveway. Margaret stepped out, carrying a paper bag filled with fresh vegetables from her garden. Her eyes met Daniel's, and they shared a warm smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, but Emily was already running to hug her. "Never," Daniel assured her. "We saved you some cookies." The afternoon passed in gentle conversation and easy laughter. The girls convinced everyone to play hide and seek, and soon the yard echoed with calls of "ready or not." Even Charles joined in, his usual corporate demeanor forgotten as he crouched behind bushes. And as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Daniel noticed how naturally they had all fallen into their roles. The Whitmores no longer arrived with an entourage of lawyers and security guards. Instead, they brought food and friendship, genuine love for both girls, and respect for the unlikely family that had formed. Grace split her time between both homes now, spending weekdays at the farmhouse with Daniel and Emily, then weekends at the Whitmore estate. The arrangement worked better than anyone had expected. She thrived in both environments, enjoying the simple pleasures of country life with Daniel and Emily, while also embracing the opportunities her birth family could provide. Emily had blossomed too. The fear of losing her sister had faded, replaced by the security of knowing Grace wasn't going anywhere. Their bond had only grown stronger through the challenges they'd faced together. As evening approached, Charles and Evelyn prepared to leave. "We'll pick Grace up Friday after school," Evelyn reminded them, hugging both girls goodbye. "Don't forget your art project," Charles added, and Grace nodded eagerly. She'd been working on a special painting for their home, combining techniques she'd learned in her new private art classes with the creative freedom Emily had always encouraged. After the Whitmores departed, Daniel, Margaret, and the girls settled onto the porch steps. The air had cooled, and fireflies began to emerge, dotting the gathering dusk with their gentle light. Grace and Emily ran to catch them in their cupped hands, releasing them with delighted giggles. "Look, Daddy," Grace called out, still getting used to using the term but saying it with increasing confidence. "This one's so bright." Daniel watched them play, feeling Margaret's quiet presence beside him. Her hand rested near his on the wooden step, their fingers almost touching. They didn't need many words between them. Their understanding had grown naturally over the weeks, built on shared values and mutual respect. The townspeople who had once whispered suspiciously about Daniel taking in a strange child now pointed to him as an example of compassion and courage. The local paper had run a feature story about their unique family, celebrating how love had triumphed over prejudice and fear. But Daniel barely noticed the attention. He was too focused on the simple joy of having his family whole and happy. Emily and Grace collapsed onto the grass, tired from their firefly chase but still giggling. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, and a sense of peace settled over the farmhouse. Daniel looked around at these people who had become his family, his daughter Emily, who had shown such wisdom and strength, Grace, whose trust and love had changed all their lives, and Margaret, whose steady presence promised possibilities he was finally ready to explore. For the first time since losing his wife years ago, Daniel felt truly complete. The empty spaces in his heart had been filled, not just with Grace's arrival, but with the way love had multiplied and grown, creating connections none of them had expected. As fireflies danced in the gathering darkness and crickets began their evening song, he savored this moment of perfect contentment. Golden streamers and colorful balloons decorated the Harris farmhouse porch, swaying gently in the late afternoon breeze. Inside, the modest living room buzzed with warmth and chatter as both families gathered around a table laden with presents and Margaret's homemade triple-layer chocolate cake, Grace's favorite. "Make a wish, sweetheart," Evelyn called out, her eyes glistening as she watched her daughter beam at the 11 flickering candles. Grace sat at the head of the table, her dark curls neatly tied back with a pink ribbon that Emily had given her that morning. She closed her eyes tight, took a deep breath, and blew out all the candles in one go. Everyone clapped and cheered, but Daniel noticed she kept one eye on Emily, sharing a secret smile with her sister. "Time for presents." Emily bounced in her seat, barely containing her excitement. She pushed a carefully wrapped package toward Grace. "Open mine first." Grace carefully peeled back the paper to reveal a handmade scrapbook, its cover decorated with pressed flowers and seashells. "Emily, it's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the delicate details. "Open it," Emily urged, scooting her chair closer. The first page showed a photograph of the Harris farmhouse on that stormy night, raindrops visible in the porch light. Daniel's breath caught as he remembered finding Grace, so small and fragile, by the roadside. The next pages chronicled their journey. Grace and Emily making cookies in the kitchen, Daniel teaching Grace to ride a bike, their first Christmas together with twinkling lights and handmade ornaments. "Look at this one," Emily pointed to a photo of Grace asleep on Daniel's shoulder during movie night. "That's when you first started calling him Dad in your sleep." Grace blushed but smiled up at Daniel, who had to clear his throat against the sudden tightness there. The pages continued, showing moments both big and small. Grace's reunion with the Whitmores, elegant parties at the mansion, quiet afternoons in Margaret's garden, and countless images of the girls together, doing homework, making crafts, or just laughing. "And here's my favorite," Emily said, turning to the last page. It showed all of them together at the courthouse, the day everything was settled. Grace stood between both families, holding Daniel's hand on one side and Evelyn's on the other, her smile radiating pure joy. "This is the most precious gift ever," Grace declared, hugging Emily fiercely. "You really are my forever sister." "And you're mine," Emily replied, squeezing back just as tight. Charles Whitmore raised his glass of lemonade. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his usual corporate demeanor softened by emotion. "To Daniel Harris, a man who showed us what true fatherhood means." Daniel shook his head modestly. "I just did what any decent person would do." "No," Evelyn interjected firmly, reaching across the table to grasp his hand. "You did so much more. When we were lost in grief, you gave our daughter a home. When others might have claimed her for themselves, you shared her with open arms. It is we who owe you everything." "Dad?" Grace's voice was small but clear. "Can I say something?" Daniel nodded, his heart swelling at the word Dad. It still felt like a gift every time she said it. Grace stood up, suddenly looking older than her 11 years. "I used to think I was nobody's daughter," she said carefully. But now I know I'm the luckiest girl in the world because I have two families who love me." She turned to Evelyn and Charles. "You're my first family, and I love you so much." Then she looked at Daniel and Emily. "And you're my forever family, my forever dad, and my forever sister." Under the table, Margaret's hand found Daniel's, her touch warm and reassuring. He squeezed back gently, remembering all the quiet conversations they'd shared in the garden, all the moments of understanding that had slowly blossomed into something more. "Well," Charles said, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief, "I think this calls for cake." Margaret stood to cut and serve the cake, her free hand lingering on Daniel's shoulder. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the unlikely gathering. The wealthy Whitmores in their designer clothes, sitting comfortably at Daniel's worn kitchen table. Emily and Grace, heads bent together over the scrapbook, already planning new pages to add. Charles telling one of his rare jokes while Evelyn actually giggled. Daniel looked around at them all, his heart full. Here at his humble farmhouse table sat a family that no one could have predicted, formed by chance, strengthened by tragedy, and bound together by grace. In the warmth of their laughter and love, he whispered quietly, "Love made us whole." Grace heard him and reached for his hand. "It really did, Dad," she said softly. "It really did." The room filled with more laughter as Charles attempted to tell another joke while Margaret served generous slices of cake. Emily pulled out her camera to capture the moment, adding to their ever-growing collection of memories. The sound of happiness, of family, of belonging, echoed through the old farmhouse as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the end, Daniel Harris never set out to be a hero. He was just a single father, a man with calloused hands and a heart still healing from loss. But when fate placed a broken little girl in his path, love transformed them all, binding two families with threads no storm could break. "Dad, there's something I never told you about that night. What secret still lingers in Grace's past? And how will it change everything they thought they knew?" Click the next video to uncover the truth. Subscribe now so you never miss a story of love, faith, and redemption. And tell us in the comments, what do you think Grace is about to reveal? Thank you for spending this time with us. Your presence here matters. I see you, I value you, and I'm so grateful you've shared in this story. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what this journey stirred in your own heart. Did it remind you of someone you've loved? A moment when kindness changed your life? Please share in the comments. Your words will touch others too. If you believe in stories that celebrate compassion, faith, and the beauty of second chances, I invite you to subscribe and follow along. Together, we can keep telling the kinds of stories this world so desperately needs. Until next time, may you feel seen, loved, and inspired. Remember, the light of love can find us even in life's darkest storms.